Hi everyone, welcome to episode 100 of the XS Noize Podcast. I'm Mark Millar. Thanks for listening. In this episode, I speak to music legend Midge Ure. If you missed the previous episode, I spoke to Craig and Charlie Reid of the Proclaimers.
At the very beginning, we wrote songs, we were in various bands from the age of about 14, 15, and then we started as the Proclaimers when we were 20. Just about to turn 21, I think. And because the kind of songs we write before were for like 3-piece bands or 4-piece bands, we started the Flamers, it was just acoustic duo. So you had to write better songs than you'd written before. And I think that happened straight away.
So check it out. And if you like the podcast, please subscribe and share it with your friends. If you want up-to-date music news, album reviews and interviews, then check out our main website at xsnoize.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. Search for the tag at XS Noize Music. Here's XS Noize writer Daniel Lynch with a taste of what's been on the website this week.
Muse are back with a new album, Will of the People. Michael Barron says that in parts the band are at their best, intense and concentrated on powerful concepts. At other times though, the album is lacking. 7 out of 10. Imelda Heher has been listening to the new album from Stella Donnelly. Imelda says that on Flood, the Australian has soundtracked The Last Days of Summer. Cold is the standout track. 8 out of 10. There's new music streaming on the website from Pulled Apart by Horses, Skinny Living and Arctic Monkeys. And there's news of Ash reissuing their third album on vinyl. Finally, XS Noize was at Gaslight Anthem's final European tour date in Belfast. The New Jersey band is back after an indefinite hiatus and planning a 6th studio album. The mood is optimistic again and the band is clearly gelling on stage, getting fans even more excited for new music. Read the full review with photos from Claire McAllister at xsnoize.com.
Midge Ure is a unique artist in today's music world. He has achieved a successful and varied career from being in the bands Slick, The Rich Kids, Ultravox, Visage and Thin Lizzy, to co-writing the second biggest selling single in UK history with Band Aid and co-organising the biggest concert the world has ever seen with Live Aid, not to mention a hugely successful solo career. In this interview, Midge talks about all of the above and lots more. So sit back, relax and enjoy episode 100 of the XS Noize Podcast with Midge Ure. Midge, welcome to the XS Noize Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You've such a varied career. You know, you've done everything, so it's going to be great to hear about it. But first of all, let's talk about Raging Eden. Following the success of 2020's reissue of Vienna, on 23rd of September, Chrysalis Records will release a box set of your second album with Ultravox, Raging Eden. Now, the song Vienna was an international hit single, and the album of the same name was huge. Did you feel pressure having to follow such an album up with Raging Eden?
I think it's quite easy to feel pressure once you've kind of set a benchmark, either musically or commercially, commercial success. You do find yourself getting the odd hint dropped as you're touring the world, promoting the Vienna album. Lots of all the record company heads would take you out to dinner after a gig or something and suggest that Tokyo would be a great title for the next record, or Sydney or whatever. So the pressure would have been on, but we were actually quite awkward. Ultravox, we kind of did everything on our own. We didn't really have much record label intervention. So they kind of left us to our own devices, really. So we did the antithesis of what we'd done with Vienna. Vienna we had written and toured and arranged and whatever, all before going into the studio. With Raging Eden, we did the opposite. We went into Connie Plank's studio in Germany with no songs and wrote and created the entire thing using the studio as a kind of synthesizer, as a kind of instrument. We wrote the entire thing there. And it's maybe a combination of cockiness, because you've had a bit of commercial success, and naivety, because you're still young and you think that whatever you do is genius. It's like, at times, and you could easily have been proven wrong. But whether we came out as geniuses or not, we ended up making an album that we really liked.
And when you went in there to start from scratch, was that the complete intention? You just thought, right, let's just go in, use the studio as an instrument and see what happens?
Yeah, absolutely. Ultravox wrote in a kind of a very different way. We didn't have one writer in the band. We all contributed. So we wrote in a rehearsal studio situation. So, all the equipment was there. We'd just throw ideas around. Somebody start jamming something. You'd kind of build on it. You'd take it and pull it apart and stick something else in there. And before you knew it, you had the bones of a piece of music. So for us going into the studio to do that, we didn't feel the time constraints that you normally would in a studio because we were working at Connie's place. It's his own studio. I don't think it was a daily rate. I think it was like, it's going to be this much to do it. Let's just get on with it and make something interesting. So whereas normally you're in a studio and it's £1,500 a day or whatever, and you've got 10 days to do it because that's your budget. So we didn't feel that kind of constraint. So the idea of working in a studio and creating something just as we would do in a rehearsal studio, but being able to record it instantly and then add things to it during the recording process was exciting to us. The idea of being in a farmyard in the middle of the countryside, 30 kilometres outside Cologne might not excite many people, but it kind of excited us. We were there with a bit of a technical genius, Connie Blank, and the idea that, he was our electronic George Martin, if you know what I mean. He was like the fifth member of Ultravox from his creativity side of things. So it was a great time.
Well, it turned out all right. Raging Eden. It turned out more ambitious and darker than Vienna. It features several long tracks: The Voice, We Stand Alone, The Thin Wall, and A Stranger Within, with the last three songs interconnected into one long sequence. So the studio experiment certainly paid off.
Well, it was, and it was darker because it kind of reflected where and what you were doing. Vienna was as a 4-piece version of Ultravox. It was our kind of baby footsteps to see what we could do, see if it would work. And Raging Eden was something above and beyond that, and it did reflect that the mood and the atmosphere. There is something kind of Groundhog Day-ish about being in a studio for 3 months where you're living there. There was no respite. There was no break from it. You didn't go out clubbing on a Saturday night or whatever. You were there working. And that reflected in the atmospheres of the songs. It was a very communal thing. It was way beyond, everyone just going in and doing their parts. Warren was writing a chunk of the lyrics. Chris was helping out on the lyric front as well. We were all dabbling with the keyboards and whatever. So it was a very much a kind of all jump in and see what we come out with thing. And not many labels, and I have to thank the label for that. Not many labels would have given you enough rope to see what you could come out with. And Chrysalis at the time really stood by it. We would deliver an album, deliver the artwork that went with the album, direct the videos and give them those. So they had very little to do with it other than, get it out there into the big wide world and let people know it was there. And
when it did get out there, it hit top 5 in the UK album charts.
More than I do. I mean, I don't know where it got, because again, it's that, I suppose most artists call it the difficult second album. And although it was the 6th album, I think, for the other guys, 6th Ultravox album, it was my 2nd album. So in that lineup, it could easily have been the difficult second album, but it wasn't. And it was quite a bit different. It shifted away, do you say, slightly more into the darker side. It shifted away from what Vienna was, which when you listen to it now, it's a reasonably coherent album, but it's not as coherent as Rage. And that was just a band, gelling and getting on better together as characters, as much as musicians.
Well, the Raging Eden 6th disc box set contains 52 tracks with 34 previously unreleased recordings, a live album, and a new stereo mix by Stephen Wilson, which sounds fantastic. Now, Stephen Wilson, he's the new go-to for mixing classic albums now, and he's an amazing artist in his own right. What do you think of his new mix?
Really good. I can't imagine. I mean, I've never met Stephen, but I know all about him, of course. And he is the I suppose he's the Bob Clearmountain of today. You know, you don't even need to check his mixes really, although we did. You know, everyone wants to hear their parts in there. And he unearthed parts that I'd never heard before. I couldn't remember playing, you know, or Billy playing or whatever. So he's brought these things to the fore. There's a clarity about it because of the technology involved in doing new mixes. Now you can clean up all sorts of stuff. There's a depth and a clarity you couldn't really get working on a 24 track, you know, analog tape machine back in the day. And it's great. I mean, I listen to the rough mixes. I haven't heard 5.1s because I don't have anything to play a 5.1 on, but it's a bit like, you know, working with, you know, an ace, you know, musician. You don't go in there and say, wouldn't it be better if you played a B flat there? You know, it's like, let them do their thing, you know, they contribute towards it. And of course, I can't imagine he does anything that he's not into, you know, sitting there going through hours and hours and hours of listening to someone else's musical meanderings. If you don't like it, it must be like purgatory. It must be horrible to do it. You know, I can't listen to a song on the radio for 3 minutes that I don't like, let alone listen to an entire album for weeks and weeks and weeks while you remix it. So yeah, he puts his heart and soul into the stuff. I
love what he did with the Thin Wall. You know, I think it sounds great.
Good. Thank you. Good. Well, I'll thank him when I eventually meet him.
The two singles released from the album, The Thin Wall and The Voice, were both top 20. And I love The Voice. What song on the album means most to you?
I think it's probably something like Slip My Mind Again. Because again, it was something that if you listen to it, it's not the sort of song that you'd walk in and say, well, I wrote this last night and sit and play it. It's very much a product of exactly what we've been talking about, you know, experimenting in the studio, which we hadn't really been allowed to do till that point. You know, Warren coming up with that echoing, you know, bass drum click, and Billy coming up with the backwards piano and stuff, and just creating something in the studio completely out of a sensation or a feeling or a line that you read in a book or whatever. And we went on to do that quite a bit afterwards, but that was the first real kind of dabblings. It had an essence of, you know, old school, you know, Pink Floyd, but done with synthesizers, if you know what I mean. It was that ambient, textural, cinematic thing, but in a very different vein from the ambient textural stuff that we had, you know, that Vienna had on it.
Well, many fans would say it's their favourite Ultravox album. Where does it sit with you in the catalogue?
It's mine as well.
Is it?
It's either Raging Eden or it's a Raging Eden with a close second being Brilliant, the very last album that we got back together to do, you know, which is an oddity in itself. But I think both those records were very coherent.
Well, I have to ask you about the classic song Vienna. It's one of the greatest synth pop songs of all time and one of my favourite songs of all time. There's never been anything like it before or since. Now, I read that you weren't a fan of the classical romantic feel of the song's orchestration, and you said this means nothing to me, to which the producer Connie Frank replied, well, sing that then. Is that what happened? What can you tell me about the genesis of the song?
Yeah, it's that's a poodle in a microwave story. That's an absolute nonsense. I have no idea where that came from at all. I had been talking to an old manager and his very drunk girlfriend or wife one evening, and she said, "Oh, you need to write a song like that Vienna." And I said, "What Vienna?" And she said, "You know that Fleetwood Mac song, you know, Vienna." I said, "What, Rihanna?" But the Vienna bit stuck in my head, and I started thinking about this decaying elegance of this, you know, once stunning city. It's still stunning, but you know, this hub of creativity where all the great composers and stuff went to live, to write, and where the secessionists went to, you know, study architecture. You know, Charles Rennie Mackintosh had been there, all of that stuff. And came up with this idea that, very simplistic, which had nothing to do with any of those things, of that sensation you get when you go away from your normal life. And it's usually on holiday or something. You go away for 2 weeks and you become somebody different in that period. You see things differently. You do things differently, and you meet someone, and, you know, you vow that this this sensation will carry on when you get back home. Of course, the moment you're back home, it all disappears again. So you're harking for that moment, that magic moment. So it was that, although we lied through our teeth and said it was about the secessionists. So it was quite a simple idea. But it's a classic example of four people, working incredibly well together. If you deconstruct that song, the song would never have happened without any of the individual members of Ultravox. So the drums and the drum pattern, that heartbeat thing and all those things, all completely down to Warren Cann. The synthesized bass completely down to Chris Cross, the Billy doing the piano stuff and the viola solo, and me constructing the melody and the lyrics and stuff. So it's a classic example. If you had to ever talk to up and coming young bands, say that when you do something like this where you all contribute an equal part, you can sometimes come up with something that's greater than the individual parts.
It's fantastic. It still gives me chills listening to it. It gives
me a headache singing it.
Well, you sound amazing. Your vocal on it is fantastic. And the song was one of the biggest sellers of '81. It's called the greatest song never to get to number one. However, it had to make as I said, peaking at number 2 for several weeks. Famously kept off the top spot by "Shut Up Your Face" by Joe Dulce. That must have really been annoying.
We were kept off the number 1 spot by 2 things. One was the Joe Dulce thing, of course, the ridiculous, to the sublime, which was John Lennon, because he had just been shot. So it was a very odd sensation, but you've got to remember, I mean, I think it irked everybody on the planet much more than it ever irked Ultravox. You remember, we had gotten to number 2 with a song that quite possibly should never have been played on the radio, or could never have been played on the radio, because it just didn't fit any of the formats. So to get something as odd as Vienna into the charts was a major, major, major feat. So to get to number 2 for the 4 or 5 weeks that we were there was unbelievable. So I think the funny thing is now that you can never find anyone who bought "Shut Up Your Face." Nobody owns up to it, but somebody did.
Somebody's out there. No, it just, it's such a staple on the radio, and it still sounds odd, even played on the radio. It's like "With or Without You" by U2. Very similar.
Yep. Very much so. Very much so. I think sometimes you've got to believe the old adage that if you do something quality, it will rise to the surface eventually. It might take a long time, and it might be because it's been, I might look at Kate Bush, Stranger Things, America hadn't a clue what a Kate Bush was. Only a handful of people, a bit like Ultravox. We were never overly successful in America. And then because it's a piece of music's heard on a TV show, it not only resonates with people, but it resonates with an entirely different generation of people who've been brought up on rap music. So you never know what's going to happen. You do something good, and eventually someone somewhere will latch onto it.
Yeah, and that song, funny you mentioned it, it's become the UK's official song of the summer all these years later. And you worked with Kate Bush on the second solo album, Answers to Nothing, the song Sister and Brother, which is fantastic. What's it like working with Kate?
I'd love to be able to tell you. I mean, I wasn't in the studio when she did her bit. I'd love to have seen it. I'd love to have been there. I'd known Kate for a few years. We'd done some Princess Trust things and stuff together and whatever. And at a Princess Trust party that they threw for the artists who donated their time and efforts and stuff, I was standing chatting to her, and she asked what I was doing, and I said, "I'm making an album, and I've got a track that I'd love you to hear and possibly sing on." And she said, "Oh, great, fantastic." She was in the middle of doing Hounds of Love, and I sent her the multi-track tape to her studio, knowing that she was in the middle of her own album, and might not hear anything back for months, and expecting her just to put a single vocal on. And she called up a couple of days later and said, "Would you like to come over and hear what I've done?" So I went over to her studio, and she played the track, hit the play button, and out came this Kate choir, this multi-tracked Kate. It was just spectacular. I'm standing there with a tear in my eye and a lump in my throat listening to this glorious woman singing, making one of my songs infinitely better. It was glorious. But I never got the chance to see her do it. But I was just grateful that she was on there.
Yeah, she's absolutely wonderful artist. Hopefully she'll release some more music in the future.
Well, when she gets round to it, she's not feeling pressurised to do it. She hasn't got a record company banging on her door saying, we need it next week, like they used to.
Ultravox reunited in 2012. You released the album Brilliant. Could you see yourself perform with Ultravox again?
I don't know. I mean, I said never, 30 years ago, whatever it is, when the band kind of finally called it a day, or in fact, I kind of walked away from it. It just didn't seem to be doing it. After the Uvox album, which was again reflected the state of the band at the time, we were just all over the place, all pulling in different directions. And I think maybe after years of having said no and not going back to it, not looking at it, not listening to any of the stuff, you kind of see it as a bit of a downer. You look back and you think, oh God, it was just a pain in the backside. And of course it wasn't. It was a brilliant period. It was incredibly creative. It was an exciting period because of the technology that was involved. We took a band that was, a bit left field and kind of traveled the world with it, which is just phenomenal. So when we did finally get back together, weirdly, we all felt the same way. We all felt like we wanted to play those tunes one more time. And after doing the tour and getting the response that we got, musicians are simple people. We decided we'd love to do it again. This time, with a new album, we'd been offered a label. A label came up to us and offered us a record deal, which I never thought we'd get. I mean, I was nearly 60 at the time, I think. Was I? No, I was mid-50s maybe at the time. And the other guys were banging on 60. And I thought, well, geez, who would have ever have expected being offered a major record deal? And of course, it didn't transpire, but we decided that we were going to do it anyway. We went off and recorded with laptops. I had a house in Canada at the time, a big log cabin. 3 of us went out there and started writing ideas, set up 3 little independent recording setups with our laptops and some speakers and a keyboard. And within the first week or so of being there, with a wealth of ideas, these things had just sparked. I mean, who would have thought that after all that time, you'd still have some kind of, bromance going on, musical bromance between you. And there it was. We ended up making an album that I have to say I'm still very proud of. It was a bold move. It could have fallen flat in its face. But it didn't. It felt good to leave Ultravox the way it was, but on a high, as opposed to leaving it on an album that certainly wasn't a high. It had moments, but it wasn't an Ultravox record. So that felt quite good. So I've kind of learned never to say never. I mean, I think since then, Billy's stated in interviews that he's done with it. Warren's now retired, living in Northern California. But I don't know. It's kind of hard to say, if the mood took you and everyone was fit and able to do it, why wouldn't you? I think we're the first generation to live through the kind of the almost octogenarian rock stars. When I was a kid joining bands, you were meant to give up at 25. You were washed up by then, and it was never meant to have longevity. Well, for the first time ever, pop music, rock music, whatever you want to call it, has a life. It's been seen as something more than just disposable nonsense. Alongside all the other genres of music that have been, this had a long lifespan, folk and jazz and, blues, classical, all of that stuff. You could walk on stage when you're 80, and as long as you can still do it, people would still want to see it and hear it. And now for the first time ever, rock music's got that. So it wouldn't be ridiculous to go out and do something again, but it might be a little difficult.
Yeah, could you imagine seeing people perform rap music, but like when they're 80? I think that would be odd.
Well, it would be good if you remembered who they were. I mean, we went through that weird dance, the whole kind of, rave dance music thing where it was all about the singles. They weren't really artists. You'd see them on Top of the Pops and then never see them again, ever. Yeah. And there seems to be a wealth of it. When they do that, when the radio plays like charts from, 35 years ago today, this was the top 10. You think, I know the noise, I know the sound, I know the bass drum, I know the rhythm, but I don't know who the hell the artist was. It's a bit like that, but we're getting back to seeing artists that will have longevity again, which is good.
You co-wrote the second biggest selling UK single in history and co-organised the biggest concert the world's ever seen. Now, I would love to have been a fly on the wall at Sarm West Studios the day Band Aid recorded Do They Know It's Christmas. What's your best memories from that day?
I was stuck behind the desk the whole time because I had done all the backing track at my studio. I'd played everything. And I think besides the fact that everybody was in pretty good behaviour, despite the fact that they had travelled from deepest, darkest Europe or whatever, hung over after a show or a wild television show they had just done. They all behaved themselves incredibly well because they all knew why they were there, and I particularly liked the fact that, we didn't have any food or drinks for anybody. There was no catering. If you wanted a sandwich, you had to go and buy one. You wanted a drink, you had to go and find one somewhere. We weren't supplying anything. So they were there to do a job, and they did it all incredibly well, considering the fact that they'd never heard the song. These days you can email it to somebody and they can learn it on the plane on the way over. They walked in cold and sat there listening to my, squawky guide vocal, playing the song to them. And they all stood up in front of each other, which is the hardest part, I think, standing up in front of your peers, to open your throat and hope that a big yodel or something didn't come out, or a massive croak because you hadn't sung that day. You hadn't warmed up. You just get up there and do your thing. So that's the outstanding stuff, I suppose. The most outstanding bit was when I'd finished the record. We had 24 hours to do all the vocals and Phil Collins' drums, which was another outstanding bit. Watching Phil, he did 2 takes, and he only did the second take because he thought he overplayed on the first one, not because he made a mistake. It was just brilliant. Was when we'd finished, because the track had to be finished by 8 o'clock the next morning, the Monday morning, to get to the pressing plants, to be cut and go to the pressing plants and start pressing the vinyl, because that takes a while. So I got in my car to drive back home after staying up all night and finishing this track. As I'm driving home, Bob took a cassette to Radio 1, and I as I'm driving home, the radio was playing. I hear Bob enter the studio, and it was Simon, whatever his name is, and Simon Bates, and he played the cassette, which is unheard of. The BBC don't play cassettes. And then as soon as the cassette finished, they rewound it and they played it for a second time. And at that second, despite the fact that you're groggy and tired and a bit irritable and hungry and whatever, at that very second, I knew that something phenomenal was happening. It was about to happen. Because that in itself was unheard of. It had never been done before. And then the rest was just like being sucked up in a whirlwind, it was just, hang on for grim death and to get through it all.
Well, apart from the drums, you played all the instruments on the track, but singing on the track, you had legendary artists such as Bono, Duran Duran, Spandau and Boy George. When you were mixing the track, and I know you're in a race against time, how many mixes with the various singers did you have to get the best version?
Well, it would have been great to have the time to get them all to sing the entire song, because then every year you could have done a remix with different people singing different lines of the song. But we didn't have the time. We hadn't even assigned who was going to sing which lines, and there weren't enough lines to give everyone a line to singing the song. So hence, halfway through a line or whatever, the vocals change, and you've got start with Sting, and then it'll end up with Simon Le Bon or whatever. So it wasn't really feasible to do that. So I had to assign lines and say, okay, right, you sing, these 2 lines, and then you sing that second line and the third line, and then you sing the third line and the fourth line. And that gave me a little bit of leeway where I could edit between the vocalists. So it wasn't to do with who was more popular or who might sell more records. Just by having their names there and their faces in the video was going to sell the record. So it was all about, which person, which voice suited that particular line. And it was amazing that Bono got the Thank God Tonight It's Them Instead of You, which was a very controversial line. Bob wrote that lyric, and his thing was to make it brutal. You say, it's not saying, thank God it's them. It's saying, thank God it's not you. Oh, this is happening in your life, and I'm talking to you, and it's not happening to you. This is why you need to pay attention to what's going on over there. And Bono had a problem with singing it, and once it was explained to him, he just did it. And I had sung it on a low register, and I thank God it's them instead of you. And of course, when it came to that line and he sang it, and I was standing next to him, he jumped up the octave. He just went for it way up there. And that just changed the entire thing. Just from that moment, it was like a pivot. The song took on another dimension.
Is there anybody who was asked to be on the record, but for whatever reason couldn't make it that day?
Yeah, I think quite a few people, but I'm not going to start naming names because I think they're probably all kicking themselves and have been doing for the last 37 years. It became one of those things that, an I was there moment, I was in the room moment. A bit like all the people that come up to me, and I'm still surprised that come up and say, I was at Live Aid and I was there, and I'm going, really? But there were 80,000 people there. So you're bound to meet somebody, but I still find it amazing that people were actually in the stadium watching it. So yeah, there were a few people who just couldn't do it.
Well, you performed with Ultravox at Live Aid. You performed 4 songs: Reap the Wild Wind, Dancing with Tears in My Eyes, One Small Day, and Vienna, of course. What was that like? What was that like, just standing there with your band and just witnessing what's happening in front of you as well?
Well, petrifying first and foremost, not necessarily because it was a massive crowd and it was being televised and stuff. That's scary enough. This was at a time when Ultravox still took 5 hours to do a sound check, prior to a concert because of the technology involved. So we chose those songs specifically because we could do them using the least equipment. And there was no sound check at Live Aid. Everyone did a line check. So you just hit, somebody would hit your keyboard, make sure it was coming through on the mixing desk, and therefore it was going out on the broadcast and going out to the public. So there was none of that. So we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants, feeling very unsafe. The security of knowing you've done your 5-hour sound check and everything's working and you can hear everything perfectly and all of that stuff, was gone. So you kind of walk out, and when you walked over your keyboard, you were just hoping and praying it was going to make a noise, or Warren would, start the drum machine and then nothing would come out, or it would play at twice the speed that it normally would, or any of those horrendous things in front of the biggest audience you were ever going to play to in your life. That made it even more petrifying. Plus the fact that as we walked on stage, we were told that, you had 18 minutes and there's a traffic light system. And you'll see it turn amber at 16 minutes, but you'll never see it turn red because the power will go off. And that was there to keep everybody in time, because we had satellite feeds and all of that. So all of that's going around your head while you're standing in front of this sea of people, on the one sunny day we had that year. It was scary stuff.
You must have had a strong drink when you come off and everything went all right.
I think I probably did, yeah. Back in those days I was. So yeah, I might have had one before I went on.
Who was your favourite performance on the day? Who do you think nailed it?
Oh, you know what? I did the classic, twatty musician thing of sitting in the audience going, oh God, I don't like this next artist, and then they come on and they were brilliant, and you go, oh, okay, but I don't like the next one. And then they'd come on and they were brilliant as well, because, you only get to that height, those heady heights by being really good at what you do. For me, it was a combination. It was a toss up between U2 and Queen for 2 very different reasons. I mean, they were both standouts. Queen had done the segued version of their greatest hits or whatever, and Freddie was just in his element. It was brilliant. And Queen are always great live anyway. But then seeing U2 on stage for the first time ever, and that mesmerizing thing, the repetitive guitar and getting the girl up dancing and just seizing the moment. It was brilliant. It changed their lives forever. It's something landed that day. With the global public, and they became the megastars that they became. But so yeah, it was a cross of those two, a combination of those two. And
in the film Bohemian Rhapsody, the way they redone the Queen performance was fantastic as well. Have you seen that?
I've never watched the movie simply because if I didn't like it, because I was going to be asked about it a million times. And I just thought, well, I'm not going to say that I liked it if I didn't. But I did see clips of the Wembley stuff, and that is uncanny. I mean, it's uncanny. I mean, I stood on that stage that day, and it was exactly what I remember, with the big old cameras and the massive, great big on-stage, monitor systems, the big wedges and the big gap in front of the stage where the photographers were, and that sea of people, and it's just, it's mind-boggling. It was amazing. So yeah, I mean, they did it incredibly well.
Let's talk a bit about some of your solo career. You released your first solo album, The Gift, in 1985. The album reached number 2 in the UK albums charts. How comfortable did you feel going solo, leaving the band behind and doing your own thing?
Well, it wasn't even a thought about going solo at all. I mean, during the process of working with George Martin on the Quartet album, I jumped into the studio. I didn't have a studio at the time, I don't think, or I was building one. But a friend gave me some studio time, and I'd always wanted to do a version of No Regrets, because I heard the Walker Brothers doing it on the first Top of the Pops that I ever did back in 1975 or 76. And I loved the song, so I went in and did that, knocked it up in a day and put that out as a single. So that had already been a single. It already had a solo record out. So Ultravox, instead of being the classic hamsters in a wheel where we were just constantly writing, recording, touring to back up that record, the moment the tour was finished, we'd be straight back in writing, recording, because there was an album every, year to 18 months at that point. That's what was required. We took a break. We took a 6-month break, before starting the next record. And of course, my studio had been built and I wanted to use it. So I had a busman's holiday and went straight in and started working on much simpler material than Ultravox was doing at the time. Straightforward, simple pop songs, instrumentals, just indulging myself. And I hadn't even told the record label I was doing it. So I completed the album and I let them hear it and they jumped at it, So it was never intended to be a replacement for Ultravox. It was just it was something that kind of grew naturally.
Well, the biggest hit from The Gift was If I Was. I remember when I was younger, the chart show used to be on the weekend and used to have all the latest videos. And If I Was, I used to record all my favourite ones. And I love the video for If I Was. You used the pins in a frame called like a pin matrix to show hands and face. Was it complex making that video with those?
It was a pain, literally. I saw one of those little, book-sized pin matrix things you stick your face in Los Angeles. And I instantly thought, oh God, you could do something with this. And I bought one way before you could get them everywhere. And, it's like an executive desktop toy. It was that kind of thing, wasn't it? And I brought it back and we started talking about doing the video. And I mentioned this pin matrix and showed what we could do with it. And we had to create things. We had to create a plinth with a pin matrix at one end, and the camera at the other of this long plinth. So that we could put the whole plinth on a swivel. Because I wanted all the pins to come out towards the lens of the camera at one point. So we had to design this thing to build it. I had my face imprint at the end, and I could do different face imprints, film a bit, different face imprint, turn it slightly, film it, and open my mouth so that it looked as though the pin matrix was singing and stuff like that. Then at the end, I wanted to tilt the whole thing up. So the camera went down, the pin matrix went up. We'd taken the front perspex off that holds the pins in place. And all the pins would fall out towards the camera. So as it's filming. So you got that whole thing about like a rainfall coming towards you. And then we found that the Royal Ballet had a full-size pin matrix that they'd used in a performance. It was 6 foot by 2.5 feet or whatever. So I thought, well, I can get my entire body into one of these, except the pins were much longer and you couldn't actually push yourself into it. So again, we had to design a way of turning this massive pin matrix on its flat with the pins hanging down, and on hydraulics, so that I could sit underneath the pin matrix or lie under it with my guitar or whatever. The camera was on top of it. the pin matrix would then get lowered down, so the pins my shape would kind of pop out of the pin matrix, and then we could reverse the film. So you could see, this thing, just me doing my thing in a pin matrix, and then it disappears back to a regular. So to create all of this stuff, it was an absolute pain. Of course, by the time that I'd finished, having stuck my face in all these pins, my face was raw. It was like somebody had scrubbed it with a metal wool or something. It was horrendous. So it was painful in all respects.
Yeah, well, it turned out all right. For a brief moment, you were in Thin Lizzy. How did that happen?
I was a Skid Row fan initially, as a spotty youth, kind of 14, 15-year-old. I'd seen Skid Row, Bruce Shields and Noel Bridgman and a very young Gary Moore playing in Glasgow, and they were outstanding. I mean, they were brilliant, totally crazed. And then I read in one of the music papers a few months later about this guy who used to be in Skid Row for a short while. Of course, that was Philip. And he was coming with his band, Thin Lizzy. So I went to see Thin Lizzy, as a three-piece, and they were just amazing. Philip was just mesmerizing to watch and listen to. He had a very distinctive voice, great presence on stage. Eric Bell was a great guitar player, very melodic and stuff, and Brian Downey, an amazing drummer. So I knew these guys, and I'd met Philip in Glasgow quite a few years before I'd moved to London. And when I moved to London to join the Rich Kids, I bumped into him in the underground, and he kind of remembered me, and we used to hang out together. So he knew that I'd just joined Ultravox. He knew that I was putting the finishing touches to Visage, because Philip used to come down to the Blitz and stuff, because Steve Strange would let him in. He's the one rock star that he would let in. And the next thing I know is I'm in the studio putting the finishing touches to Fade to Grey, and I get a phone call. It's Philip's office saying he's going to call you in a minute. He's in Arkansas. So he called up and said, "Hey, we're opening up for Journey. We've got 3 weeks left of the tour. Gary Moore's out the band. Can you come out tomorrow and finish the tour?" And it's not one of the sort of things, when moments like that happen, you don't say, "No, I'm not good enough." You say, "Of course," and then try and figure it out and just hope that you are good enough to pull it off. And I thought, well, I'll learn the set. They were opening up for Journey. They were doing a 45-minute set or a 50-minute set or something. And I thought, I'll learn all the songs in the plane. And of course, they flew me out in Concorde. So my first experience of going to America was flying out on Concorde, getting a connecting flight from New York down to New Orleans, which doesn't look anything like America, and then spending the first night in a hotel room with Scott Gorham, the other guitar player, working out all the harmony guitar parts. And the next night we're on stage in front of 30,000 people. Wow. It was fantastic. But I was never there as a permanent replacement. I was there as a hired gun. And even when they were trying out other guitarists and ended up with Snowy White, I did the Irish tour and I did some dates in the UK. I did the Japanese tour. So there are quite a few things that I did with them, all the time knowing that Ultravox was my band. We were working on the VN album at the time. But you co-wrote Yellow Pearl with Phil. Yeah, that was something that we used to jam, because when they were trying new guitarists, new permanent replacements, or trying to find a permanent replacement, Phil had obviously been listening to what I'd been doing. And he said, "Oh, we need some keyboards in the band." And I thought, really? Keyboards in Thin Lizzy? Why? What's the point? I mean, I've never heard them. To this day, I've never heard Pearl Darn's keyboards. It's all guitar. It should be all guitar. It's Thin Lizzy. So I didn't say no. I thought, yeah, this is great fun. So I went off and did my keyboard bit up the back. And then for the last 5 numbers or something, I'd come down on guitar and join in with everybody else. And during the sound checks, I used to jam that little da-da-da-da-da, and Philip would play his bass and go, "I like that." And when he was doing his solo album, he called up and said, can we work on that track? Can we try and do something? So I pulled in Billy Curry, who was very good with sequencers and stuff. And we started making this electronic track, which turned into Yellow Pearl. And then we did a remix for Top of the Pops. So Philip was ecstatic about that. He thought, this is brilliant. He didn't write any of the track except the vocals. And they didn't use the vocals on Top of the Pops. So he was more Scottish than I was, I think. He loved the idea he was getting paid every time this theme was getting played and didn't have to do anything for it.
It still stands up, that track, actually.
It's good. It's funny. I've been playing the instrumental version. I did it on the 1980 tour when we went out and played the entire Vienna album 3 years ago. And I opened up with that, and the amount of people who went, "Wow, top of the pops!" Oh, it's fantastic. I just didn't do the vocal part. I just did like 2 minutes of the instrumental. It's a great opener for a show, you know.
You'll soon begin your twice delayed Voice and Visions tour, performing songs from Raids in Eden and solo songs. Are you glad to be finally going out and doing these shows?
Oh, ecstatic. It's very difficult to explain to somebody what it's like having something that you've done naturally your entire life, having it taken away from you. And it must be what Phil Collins feels like now. You know, he can't play drums anymore and stuff because of his spinal problems. And that's just horrendous. It's horrendous. And because maybe if somebody had said it's going to be 2.5 years at the beginning, you could have gone, okay, psychologically I can get around it. I know I'm coming back to it. But everyone thought 3 months, you know, we'll be back and it'll be normal and everything will be fine. And it's just rolled on and rolled on and rolled on. And the disappointment from not just the audience's point of view, but the band point of view and the crew, you know, who have suffered dreadfully. You know, for the last 2.5 years, there's been no infrastructure, there's been no help. You know, there's been a lot of fatalities. A lot of people just couldn't hack the idea that they didn't know where the next pound was coming from and how they were going to survive in our industry, an industry that generates billions and billions of pounds, you know, for the UK, that they couldn't deal with it. So the disappointment has been palpable. It's certainly for me, you know, the draw, the idea of going out and getting on stage and doing what you do. Weirdly, about a year after, because we found out about it on tour, we were in New Zealand when we heard about this, and we just managed to get around Australia and just managed to get home before everything locked down. But a year after that, I did a studio recorded live concert, televised concert thing. And my voice was absolutely horrendous. I mean, horrendous, because I've never not sung. So I don't sing about the house. I don't, you know, do little concerts for my kids. You know, it's, you know, if you're not out touring, you're not using it. And it was like an athlete trying to run a marathon without doing any training. And it was awful. And at that point, I thought, it's over. It's over. It's gone. It'll never come back again. You know, it has. Fortunately for me, maybe not so much everybody else out there. But, yeah, the desire to do it is huge, and the excitement about doing it is huge.
I've noticed there's no Irish dates at the moment on the tour list. People have been asking me, can you ask Midge, is there going to be Irish shows?
Well, you have to be asked for a start. We did a show in Dublin about 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. It was just a one-off, and it was great fun. It was fabulous. The problem with coming over to Ireland, and to be absolutely honest about you, is Brexit. Traveling anywhere. I mean, traveling into Europe is an absolute nightmare. Anything that involves getting on a boat, or a train or a channel or any of that stuff involves carnets, which is a list of every piece of equipment you've got. We're hearing, because we're living this, we're hearing horror stories about bands going off to Europe to do festivals and stuff, and they just don't get there. They're leaving 3 days before the festival. And they don't get there because every border they cross, they're stopped, and the carnets have to be checked. They have to wait for hours to get through. We have done this to ourselves, this ridiculous Brexit thing. And it's the knock-on effect is absolutely horrendous. So twofold, we have to be invited to come and play Ireland. And if we were doing it, you'd have to do 5 or 6 shows just to break even. And so far the invites haven't come in yet. They made, we keep talking about the tour starting. What we're actually doing is doing the last 4 dates of the last time the tour was rescheduled. We're doing those first because they never got moved. All the other dates got moved to spring of next year. So those 4 dates what I was just about to do were supposed to be the last 4 dates we were going to do. So there's plenty of time between now and when the tour is supposed to kick off in April next year to try and get some Irish dates. But I'd love to, you know, it's my home from home, Ireland. I seem to be forever connected, with the place, either, you know, through Bob or Philip. So yeah, you know, it's my second home. We're all Celts. We're all there. My great grandmother was from Northern Ireland, so I've got that blood in me.
Whereabouts?
It's about 30 miles from Bangor, because we've only recently got, someone sent me a family tree. I've never done one. And I'm looking back and I'm going, and I knew my great grandmother was born in Ireland, but I didn't know where. Because I don't have any, my parents are gone and stuff. So there's no one to ask about this stuff. Ask your parents everything. Because once they go, that line has gone. You can't get all the inside information. So I've only recently found that out. So,
what's your favourite song that you've ever written, either solo or with any of the bands?
That's really difficult. I tend to choose the miserable ones. The one that I was most surprised about was a track I wrote weirdly on the Ultravox album, a track called All Fall Down, which is a classic Celtic oriented protest song. And you think, well, where did that come from? And I managed to get Ultravox and the Chieftains, playing on that track. And I think lyrically it stands up. It's sad to say it still stands up. It's just, bombasting the people that we choose to, guide us through our lives. And we choose badly sometimes. And it's just giving the politicians a bit of a hard time, which is fine. I give politics a hard time and I give religion a hard time. It's what I do.
Well, you haven't released an album of original music since Fragile in 2014, I think. Do you have any plans for a new album soon in the future?
I think I've realised that the longer you take on a new project, the more likely you are to start hating it because you've lived with it for such a long time. I started working on a new album about 5 years ago. And I've gone on things, I've gone off them, and I've changed it. But then I got bored, and I ended up writing an entire instrumental album, which I've just finished. And that's been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed the whole process of writing this ambient, textural, cinematic thing. And with a lot of piano, and I'm not a piano player by any stretch of the imagination. So I've thoroughly enjoyed doing that. But I'm going to get back on the horse now and go back and look at all the stuff that I've done. I've done a wealth of stuff for the next song album, and try and be brutal about it and knuckle down and get it finished. Because I know that a lot of people are waiting for it, especially after Fragile. I mean, a lot of people like Fragile. It got better reviews than anything that I've ever done. Having been told by my label that I needed a producer and I needed other musicians and I needed to do it in a different studio, I told them where to go and ended up doing it all myself and thoroughly enjoyed that process as well.
Last one, Midge. You've had such a successful and varied career from Slick, The Rich Kids, Ultravox, Visage, Thin Lizzy, Band-Aid, and of course your solo work. If you could go back and relive one musical moment from your career, what would it be?
Okay, I'm going to go back and say this. My guitar hero when I was a kid, one of my guitar heroes, Mick Ronson, who was David Bowie's sideman in Spiders from Mars. Brilliant, great guitar player. I had asked Mick to come out on tour with me to play guitar on the Gift tour, when the Gift album had come out. And he agreed to do it. And in rehearsals, I didn't quite understand what was going on because every day Mick would play something different and or forget the arrangements or whatever. And he may have been ill at the time. I didn't know that. He never mentioned it. And I had the horrific task of having the band come to me and say, you can't go out like this, and they were all massive Ronson fans. So you can't go out like this. I had to phone him up and tell him that he couldn't do the tour. And I think in hindsight, I'd go back to that very moment and not make the call. I never saw him again, which is a real pity. And it left a really odd taste in my mouth, because he influenced my playing a lot. A lot of what I do, the long sustaining notes and stuff, came directly from him. So I think had I been old and wise like I am now, I would have made a very different decision and just talked him through it and gone with whatever he came out with, because I'm sure it would have all fallen into place at the time. But because I had people in the band who I trust and admire saying, this isn't working. Maybe I was seeing it through rose-tinted glasses and hoping it was going to be okay. Mm-hmm. But I would go back and change that. All the other stuff, I'd never change. Even the bad bits were good. It's, even the bits that were in abject misery led on to something else that I couldn't see in the horizon. So, I wouldn't change anything.
Yeah, because everything happens for a reason, really.
It's absolutely true, and you don't know what's out there. You don't know where it's going to take you. And you can panic about it, and you can get depressed when your latest record gets slated or never gets played in the radio or whatever. But, a bit like, Kate and, running up that hill, you do something good, so finally it'll get to the surface at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Midge, thanks very much for taking the time to do this here. Really,
absolute pleasure.
Enjoyed it. It was a pleasure talking to you. Absolute legend, so much more.
Isn't legend what you're called just before you die? Isn't that it? That's the accolade.
No, you can be a legend now.
Or maybe that's institution. Maybe it's legend, institution,
But you're very unique, actually, because there's nobody that's had such a varied career and been successful with everything you've done, more or less, so, yeah.
Well, I was kind of, without sounding too cliched, this is what I always wanted to do. And as long as I'm physically and, hopefully able to do it, I'll carry on doing it. I can't think of anything better. Working in B&Q is not going to cut it for me,
Well, I wish you all the best with the tour. Hopefully you'll get to Belfast and Dublin or around Ireland at some stage. And
I certainly hope so. I hope so.
I'll look forward to hearing the new stuff when it comes out.
It'll be soon.
Good. Okay, Midge. Well, have a good day, mate.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Take it easy.
Okay. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.